This is a live human reading of The Grasshopper, Games, Life, and Utopia by Bernard Suits. Introduction by Thomas Hurka. Though not widely known, Bernard Suits's The Grasshopper is one of the most remarkable philosophy books of the 20th century. It's utterly unique, a book without peers. This is partly because of its style. Most philosophical works are sober and even ponderous. But The Grasshopper is wonderfully funny, as befits its topic of games. You read it with a broad smile on your face, punctuated by loud guffaws. This is laugh-out-loud philosophy. But The Grasshopper is also completely philosophically serious, both in what it says and in how it argues for it. Suits proposes an analysis of playing a game, and then argues that game playing is the supreme human good, since in the ideal conditions of utopia, where all instrumental goods are provided, it would be everyone's main pursuit. This second claim is profound, giving the clearest possible expression of a modern as against a classical view of value, that of Marx and Nietzsche, say as against that of Aristotle. And Suits's defense of the analysis that precedes it is a model of philosophical argumentation, addressing every possible objection before resting its case. The book's light tone, therefore, hides an utterly serious content, and it's this combination that makes The Grasshopper so unique, that it can delight and entertain while also defending important philosophical claims. The book is written as a dialogue between the grasshopper and his disciples, especially the aptly named Skepticus. The grasshopper himself is the character from Aesop's fable, who played games all summer and will die now that winter is approaching, while the ant stockpiled food and will live. But Suits reverses the traditional moral of the tale. While Aesop extols the value of work, Suits's book contains the grasshopper's apologia. His game-playing may have had lethal consequences, but it involved him in the activities that are intrinsically best, or most worthwhile in themselves. Its dialogue form is the basis of the book's style, which is breezy and conversational. There is much mutual teasing between the grasshopper and Skepticus, and many witty turns of phrase. Regretting the contingency that will cause his demise, the grasshopper says, "If there were no winters to guard against, the grasshopper would not get his comeuppance, nor the ant his shabby victory." Responding that most people want to combine work and play, Skepticus makes the spooneristically inevitable suggestion that they want to be asshoppers and grants. Later he says, "While all work and no play undoubtedly make Jack a dull ant, all play and no work makes Jack a dead grasshopper." And there's more. In much of the book, Skepticus and the grasshopper develop their arguments by constructing elaborate scenarios populated by fanciful characters. One involves the retired generals Ivan and Abdul, who dislike being bound by rules and try to play a game without any. Their story also explains why there's no such thing as Turkish roulette or Russian delight. Another has Sir Edmund Hillary arrive at the top of Everest to find a bowler-hatted Englishman there clutching a copy of The Times. He's taken an escalator up the other side. Yet another involves a 200-meter race with an infield populated by man-eating tigers and a time bomb about to explode at the finish line. And a discussion of role-playing games, such as Cops and Robbers, introduces Porfirio Sneak, the greatest spy in history, who was able to impersonate any political figure in the world, and did. The dialogue form derives from Plato, and much of The Grasshopper is therefore a loving parody of the Platonic dialogues, with the grasshopper as Socrates and Skepticus as the disciple, who always eventually comes round to his master's view. But there's also a closer connection. The grasshopper's situation, as he faces death, parallels that of Socrates in the Apology, Crito, and Phaedo, which are set just before his execution by the Athenian authorities. Socrates' friend suggests various ways in which he can escape death, but he rejects them all, in part because they involve giving up philosophical conversation, which he thinks is the best activity possible for anyone. Similarly, the Grasshopper's friends offer him food to get through the winter, but he turns them down because game playing is the best possible activity and one to which he, in particular as a grasshopper, must remain true. So the grasshopper defends the activity that's brought him close to death, just as Socrates did, and, like Socrates, refuses to give up that activity even to save his life. The parallel is delightful for anyone who recognizes it, but it's present in so unobtrusive a way that a reader who doesn't know Plato won't notice that she's missing a thing. And this is a general feature of Suits's humor, which is never showy or distracting. It's in the North American tradition of broad or popular comedy as against, say, the refined English wit of Bernard Williams, another amusing philosopher. But like Williams's, it doesn't distract from the philosophical argument or get in the way of Suits's main points. On the contrary, it helps make them in a more compelling way. The contest between Ivan and Abdul, the Englishmen up top Everest, the man-eating tigers, all convey Suits's philosophical ideas more strikingly than an abstract discussion ever could. These philosophical ideas divide in two. The beginning and end of the Grasshopper argue that playing games is the supreme intrinsic good, while the middle gives Suits's analysis or definition of playing a game. This isn't a definition of the sort found in a dictionary, which describes how people use a word. It's what philosophers call a conceptual analysis, or set of necessary and sufficient conditions for playing a game. The necessary conditions for a concept, X, are those properties anything must have if it's to count as an X, and whatever has the sufficient conditions is an X. So the necessary and sufficient conditions for a concept X are those properties shared by all X's that make them X's, whether or not people who talk about X's know what they are. And Suits wants to identify these properties for the concept of playing a game. His analysis has three main elements, which he calls the prelusory goal, the constitutive rules of the game, and the illusory attitude. An activity must have each if it's to count as playing a game, and any activity with all three counts. Let's look at them in turn. To begin with the prelusory goal. In playing a game, one always aims at a goal that can be described independently of the game. In golf, this is that a ball enters a hole in the ground. In mountain climbing, that one stand on top of a mountain. In Olympic 200-meter sprinting, that one cross a line on the track before one's competitors. Suits calls this goal prelusory from the Latin ludus for game, because it can be understood and achieved apart from the game, and he argues that every game has such a goal. Of course, in playing a game, one also aims at a goal internal to it, such as winning the race, climbing the mountain, or breaking par. But on Suits's view, this illusory goal is derivative, since achieving it involves achieving the prior prelusory goal in a specified way. This way is identified by the second element, the game's constitutive rules. According to Suits, the function of these rules is to forbid the most efficient way to the prelusory goal. Thus, in golf, one may not carry the ball down the fairway and drop it in the hole by hand. One must advance it using clubs, play it where it lies, and so on. In mountain climbing, one may not ride a gondola to the top of the mountain or charter a helicopter. In 200-meter sprinting, one may not start before one's competitors or cut across the infield. Once these rules are in place, success in a game typically requires achieving the prelusory goal as efficiently as they allow, such as getting the ball into the hole in the fewest possible strokes, or choosing the best way up the mountain. But this is efficiency within the rules, whose larger purpose is to forbid the simplest means to the game's initial goal. These first two elements involve pursuing a goal by less than the most efficient means, but they aren't sufficient for playing a game. That's because someone can be forced to use these means by circumstances he regrets and wishes were different. If this is the case, if, for example, a farmer plows and harvests his field by hand because he can't afford the mechanical equipment he'd much rather use, he's not playing a game. Hence, the need for the third element in Suits's analysis, the illusory attitude, which involves a person's willing acceptance of the constitutive rules or acceptance of them because they make the game possible. Thus, a golfer accepts that he may not carry the ball by hand or improve his lie because he wants to play golf, and obeying those rules is necessary for him to do so. The mountaineer accepts that he may not take a helicopter to the summit because he wants to climb, and so on. The restrictions the rules impose are adhered to, not reluctantly, but willingly, because they're essential to the game. Adding this third element gives Suits's full analysis. To play a game is to attempt to achieve a specific state of affairs for illusory goal, using only means permitted by the rules, where the rules prohibit the use of more efficient in favor of less efficient means, constitutive rules, and where the rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity, illusory attitude. Or, in Suits's elegant summary statement, playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. This is a lovely analysis, and fun to apply to different games. Take rock, paper, scissors. Its illusory goal is to throw rock to your opponent's scissors, scissors to his paper, or paper to his rock. Its rules forbid the most efficient means to this goal, since they forbid you to make your throw after he's made his. And players willingly accept this restriction. They don't wish they could somehow see their opponent's throw first. The analysis may not fit every use of the English word game. Mountain climbing is one of Suits's central examples, but it's not usually called a game, though it is, of course, a sport. And Suits has to deny that Ring Around the Rosie, which many people would call a game, is one. It's a kind of dance to vocal accompaniment, he writes, or a choreographed song. It is no more a game than Swan Lake is. While these minor mismatches might be serious objections to a dictionary definition of game, they needn't be to a conceptual analysis if the analysis picks out a phenomenon that's unified, close to what's meant by game, and philosophically important. And the analysis is important if the game playing Suits defines as a central human good, and especially if the analysis explains why game playing is good, as I'll argue shortly that it does. But his analysis also has more general significance. Around the middle of the 20th century, many philosophers took conceptual analysis to be the central business of philosophy, though they usually applied it to abstract concepts such as knowledge and causation rather than to everyday ones like game playing. But by the time The Grasshopper was published in 1978, this view had been attacked, decisively many thought, from two directions. One was the philosophical naturalism of the American philosopher W.V.O. Quine, who said, "There are no conceptual truths for philosophy to discover, all truths are scientific." The other was Ludwig Wittgenstein's claim that concepts don't have the determinate contents or sharp edges that conceptual analysis requires. It isn't in general possible, he said, to give necessary and sufficient conditions for a concept's application. Its instances are linked only by a looser set of family resemblances. And Wittgenstein's central example in this anti-definist argument was precisely the concept of a game. His philosophical investigations argued that there's no common essence shared by all games, just a series of uncodifiable similarities, and then generalized that conclusion to other concepts. In 1978, This view was thought by many philosophers to have exploded the once central project of philosophical analysis. There's no suggestion in The Grasshopper that Suits thinks conceptual analysis is the primary task of philosophy, or that every concept allows such analysis. But in giving necessary and sufficient conditions for playing a game, he's doing exactly what Wittgenstein says can't be done, and doing it about Wittgenstein's own example. His book is therefore a precisely placed boot in Wittgenstein's balls. But with his characteristic lightness of touch, Suits mentions the Austrian philosopher only once. "Don't say," he quotes Wittgenstein as admonishing us, "there must be something in common, or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all." This is unexceptionable advice, Suits comments. Unfortunately, Wittgenstein himself did not follow it. He looked, to be sure, but because he had decided beforehand that games are indefinable, his look was fleeting, and he saw very little. This is exactly right. The claim that some philosophical task is impossible is legitimately made only by someone who has made serious attempts to complete it and found that they fail. Wittgenstein made no such attempt at the analysis of games, and his followers have made even less. The contrast with Suits couldn't be more stark. Having proposed his analysis in Chapter 3 of The Grasshopper, he spends the next 10 chapters considering possible counterexamples to it, some involving games that seem not to fit his definition, and others involving activities that do seem to fit the definition but aren't games. The counterexamples all look initially compelling, but he shows repeatedly that his analysis handles them correctly, and not by some ad hoc addition, but by using its central elements once those are properly understood. His book is therefore a model of intellectual integrity, subjecting its ideas to rigorous critique before presenting them as true. His book also shows up the superficiality of Wittgenstein's discussion. Its analysis of game playing is structural, citing abstract properties, a goal, rules about means to the goal, and an attitude to the rules that can be shared by activities with quite different surface features. But Wittgenstein notes only surface differences between games, that some are amusing and some not, that some use playing cards and some not, without even wondering whether they may not be consistent with a deeper commonality. Suits has nothing like Wittgenstein's philosophical reputation, but on this topic, he's the real philosopher. His analysis also answers a broader worry. Some philosophers have asked how a conceptual analysis can ever be informative. It's supposed to show what's really involved in a concept we already understand, and the fact that we understand it explains why we can recognize it as correct when it is. Yes, that's exactly what I had in mind. But if it only tells us what we already know, how can it be other than old news? This paradox of analysis, as philosophers call it, is resolved if we can grasp a concept partly but not fully, or can apply its defining conditions subconsciously but without conscious awareness. Then the analysis can make explicit to us what we previously knew only implicitly, or without knowing we knew it. And that's what Suits's analysis so beautifully does. We recognize that it captures what we really had in mind in talking about games. Yes, that's what all those things have in common, but couldn't formulate explicitly ourselves. So, Suits's analysis of game playing shows in various ways how conceptual analysis can be illuminating, but his book would be much less interesting if it contained only analysis, and it doesn't. It also argues that game playing is the supreme human good, or the activity most worth choosing for itself. Suits here addresses the classical philosophical question, which was also a favorite of Socrates, of what the best human life is, and gives an answer that, though exaggerated, contains a distinctive and important truth. Suits's argument is that in the ideal conditions of utopia, game playing would be everyone's primary activity. But he understands utopia in a specific way, as a world in which all work or instrumental activity has been eliminated. Whenever someone wants an end, X, he doesn't have to labor to produce the means to it. That's done for him by machines that he can activate by mental telepathy, so he can get anything he wants instantaneously. In our non-utopian world, we have to work to make money. In Utopia, even the most acquisitive cravings for the Gettys and Onassis of society are instantly satisfied. We also devote considerable energy to finding love. In Utopia, the necessity for all this hard work is removed, and sexual partners are every bit as accessible as yachts and diamonds. Likewise for knowledge, since everything it's impossible to know is stored in computers. So what, Suits asks, will people do in Utopia? What activities will they engage in? He answers that they'll place unnecessary obstacles in the way of the ends they could achieve instantaneously, just so they can enjoy the process of overcoming them. One character he describes decides that rather than get houses by pressing telepathic buttons, he'll build them by traditional carpentry, just for the sake of exercising that skill. Another decides not to access the scientific information in the computers so he can discover it by old-fashioned experimentation. The playwright Gotthold Ephraim Lessing said that if God gave him a choice between truth and the search for truth, he would unhesitatingly choose the search for truth. Suits' character has the same attitude. And likewise for other activities. But then what people in Utopia do is in effect play games, just as golfers and hockey players do. They willingly pursue a goal by what they recognize aren't the most efficient means. And the fact that this is the central utopian activity shows that game playing is the supreme intrinsic good, the one most worth choosing for itself, or apart from its effects. Suits' claim of supreme value for game playing is bold. In fact, too bold to be believable. If we think about it, there's no supreme good. Many different things have value, and many different good lives can be built around them. Nor are Suits' arguments for his claims persuasive. He says there won't be any moral action in Utopia, because that consists in preventing or rectifying some evil, and there's no evil in Utopia. Nor will people create art, since its subject matter, which he takes to be human hopes and fears, triumphs and tragedies, has disappeared. But while one form of moral virtue consists in compassion for another's pain, another involves joy in her happiness, and that can exist in Utopia. Similarly, art can express joy. While Joni Mitchell wrote many teary breakup songs, she also wrote Chelsea Morning. And Suits loads the deck by asking only what people will do in Utopia. Many human goods aren't activities but states of being, like having knowledge about the world or feeling pleased. Maybe they're already present in Utopia, or available at the push of a button, but that doesn't stop them from being good in the same way game playing is, and part of what makes Utopia wonderful. Suits may be handcuffed here by his parallel with Socrates. After all, Socrates didn't say just that philosophical conversation is one good thing among others. He said it's the only thing worth living for. And he had to say that if he was to justify his decision to accept death. If there were other equally good activities, he could escape from Athens and live equally well by engaging in them. Likewise, the Grasshopper has to say game playing is supremely good if he's to justify his decision to die. But outside the dialogues, those claims aren't believable. So, Suits exaggerates when he calls game playing the supreme good. But it can still be one intrinsic good among many. It can also be an important and even paradigmatic good, and it's Suits' achievement to have shown how. There are two issues here: why game playing is good, and why it's the clearest possible expression of modern values. The Grasshopper doesn't explicitly connect the value of games to his definition of games, but it's arguable the two are more closely tied than Suits ever says. More specifically, it's arguable that the different elements of the definition give game playing two different but related grounds of value, so it's good in two ways at once. Consider first the prelusory goal and constitutive rules. By forbidding the most efficient means to the goal, the rules usually make for an activity that's reasonably difficult. They don't always do so. The rules of rock, paper, scissors make achieving its goal harder than it could be, but they don't make it, by absolute standards, difficult. Rock, paper, scissors isn't a challenging activity, but then rock, paper, scissors isn't a very good game, and it's in fact characteristic of good games to be not only more difficult than they could be, but also, in absolute terms, reasonably difficult. They can't be so difficult that no one can succeed at them, then there would be no point playing. But they also can't lack all challenge. They must strike a balance between too much and too little difficulty. So in good games, which include all those that would be played in Utopia, the rules make achieving the prelusory goal reasonably difficult. This will give playing these games one kind of value if difficult activities are as such good, and this is an attractive view. If we think about the things that are intrinsically good, one is surely achievement, or accomplishing something in your chosen field, be it business, art, raising a family, or whatever. Now, achievement involves realizing a goal, but not every such realization is an achievement. For example, tying your shoelace isn't unless you have some disability. And among achievements, some are more valuable than others. Thus, starting a new business and making it successful is a greater achievement than making a single sale. If we ask what explains these differences between achievements and non-achievements, and between greater and lesser achievements, the answer is surely in large part their difficulty, how complex or physically challenging they are, or how much skill and ingenuity they require. So if doing difficult things is as such good, playing good games will in that respect be intrinsically valuable. What about the illusory attitude? It contributes a further ground of value, but to see how, we have to notice a switch in how Suits discusses it. When he's giving his analysis of playing a game, Suits takes the illusory attitude to be one of accepting the rules because they make the game possible. For example, accepting the rules of golf because they make golf golf. This allows professionals, who play in part to make money, to count as having the illusory attitude, and it even allows what we can call pure professionals, who play only for money, with no interest in the game as such, to count. A pure professional golfer, for example, knows that to make money he must play golf, which means obeying all its rules. He may accept the rules only as a means to money, but he does accept them in order to play golf, and so has the illusory attitude. And it's essential for Suits's analysis to say this, since it would be absurd to deny that a pure professional golfer is playing golf. But when he argues for the value of games, Suits's understanding of the illusory attitude implicitly switches. His argument, recall, is that in Utopia, game playing would be everyone's main pursuit. But his definition of Utopia as a world where instrumental activity has been abolished means it would contain no professionals. No one would play golf as a means to money, or indeed to any external goal, since they wouldn't need to. All golfers would be pure amateurs, who played the game only for itself, and the same goes for all other games. But then people in Utopia would accept the rules of the games they played not just because they made the games possible, but also because they made them difficult. And that's in fact what Suits's characters do. One builds houses by carpentry rather than telepathically, because it requires more skill. Another does old-fashioned research because it's a challenge. In fact, Suits's central idea is that in Utopia, people will accept limitations just in order to overcome them, and just because it makes things harder. And he's quite explicit about this. When he discusses professionals, he makes the surprising observation that someone who's playing a game needn't be playing. You might have thought that just followed as it follows that someone who's hitting a ball is hitting. But to play, Suits says, is to engage in an activity for its own sake, and a pure professional isn't doing that. He's working. So Suits's definition of game playing isn't a definition of playing. Yet at the start of his discussion of utopia, he says he'll defend the value of game playing as a specific form of play, that is, game playing with an at least partly amateur attitude, or what I'll call playing in a game. And playing in a game involves the narrower, illusory attitude of accepting the rules because they make the game difficult. Nor is this narrower attitude found only in the imaginary conditions of utopia. Most real-world game players, including most professionals, play at least partly for the game's own sake. Consider Pete Rose, an extremely hard-nosed baseball player who was disliked for how much he would do to win. Taking the field near the end of the famous sixth game of the 1975 World Series, he told the opposing team's third base coach, "Win or lose, Popeye, we're in the fucking greatest game ever played." Intensely as he wanted to win, he also loved baseball for itself. But if playing in a game involves this narrower, illusory attitude, then it has a second kind of value. The elements that define this type of playing are now internally related. The pre-illusory goal and constitutive rules give it a feature, namely difficulty, and the illusory attitude chooses it because of this feature. More specifically, if difficulty is in itself good, the goal and rules give it a good-making feature, and the illusory attitude chooses it because of that good-making feature. This connects the illusory attitude to an attractive view that's been held by many philosophers. Whenever something is intrinsically good, caring about it for the properties that make it good is also, and separately, intrinsically good. Thus, if another person's happiness is good, desiring, pursuing, and being pleased by her happiness as happiness is a further good, namely that of benevolence. Likewise, if knowledge is good, desiring, seeking, and being pleased by knowledge for itself is good. And the same type of good is present in playing in games, which combines the initial good of difficulty with the further good of loving difficulty for itself. The pre-illusory goal and constitutive rules together give playing in games one ground of value, namely difficulty. The illusory attitude in its amateur form adds a related but distinct ground of value, namely loving something good for the property that makes it good. The second ground is derivative from the first. Loving difficulty wouldn't be good unless difficulty were good. But it adds a further, complementary intrinsic good. When you play in a game, you both do something good and do it from a motive that latches onto what makes it good. This two-part explanation deepens Suits's claim that playing in games is an intrinsic good by connecting it to more general principles that apply beyond the case of games. But it further undercuts his bold claim that playing in games is the supreme good. Not only are there goods independent of games, such as pleasure and knowledge, but the values present in them can also be found outside of games. If a farmer works his land by hand when he would rather use mechanical equipment, he doesn't have any illusory attitude and isn't playing any game. But if his activity is difficult and he successfully completes it, his activity still has considerable worth. The value of loving goods can likewise be found outside of games, for example, in being pleased by another's happiness or seeking knowledge for itself. Moreover, the explanation makes playing in games not a fundamental, but a derivative good. It wouldn't appear on a list of basic goods, since it combines two other, more fundamental given goods in a specific way. But a good that isn't fundamental can nonetheless be paradigmatic, because it gives the clearest possible expression of a certain type of value. And that's what playing in games does. If difficult activities are as such good, they must aim at some goal. It's achieving that which is challenging. But their value doesn't derive from properties of the goal considered in itself, depending instead on features of the process of achieving it. Yet this dependence can be obscured if the goal is independently good, since then the activity, if successful, is instrumentally good, or good as a means, and this can seem the most important thing about it. If the farmer who works by hand successfully harvests a crop, his work contributes to the vital good of feeding his family, and this can distract us from the value it has in itself. But there's no such danger if the goal is intrinsically valueless, as it most clearly is in games. Since a game's prelusory goal, getting a ball into a hole in the ground or standing atop a mountain, is intrinsically trivial, the value of playing the game can depend only on facts about the process of achieving that goal. And this point is underscored by the illusory attitude, which is directed at that process just as a process, since it willingly accepts rules that make achieving the goal harder. Playing must have some external goal one aims at, but the specific features of this goal are irrelevant to the activity's value, which is entirely one of process rather than product, journey rather than destination. That's why playing in games gives the clearest expression of a modern as against a classical view of value, because the modern view centers on the value of process. The contrary classical view was defended by Aristotle and is implicit in his division of all activities into the two categories of kineses, or movements, and energeiae, often translated as actualities. A kinesis is an activity aimed at a goal external to it, as driving to Toronto is aimed at being in Toronto. It's therefore brought to an end when that goal is achieved, which means kineses can be identified by a grammatical test. If the fact that you've x'd implies that you are no longer xing, as the fact that you've driven to Toronto implies that you are no longer doing so, then xing is kinesis. By contrast, an energeiae isn't directed at any external goal, but has its goal internal to itself. Contemplation is an energeiae, as is enjoying yourself, or feeling pleased. Energeiae doesn't pass the grammatical test, and therefore, unlike kineses, can be carried on indefinitely. The fact that you've contemplated doesn't imply that you're not contemplating now, and won't continue to contemplate in the future. Now, Aristotle held that energeiae are more valuable than kineses, so the best human activities must be ones that can be carried on continuously, like contemplation and being pleased by contemplation. He thought this because he assumed that the value of a kinesis must derive from that of its goal, so its value is subordinate and even just instrumental to that of its goal. As he said, where there are ends apart from the actions, the defining characteristic of a kinesis, it is the nature of the products to be better than the activities. But it's characteristic of modern values to deny this assumption, and to hold that there are activities that necessarily aim at an external goal, but whose value is internal to them in the sense that it depends entirely on features of the process of achieving that goal. Suits cites expressions of this modern view by Kierkegaard, Kant, Schiller, and Georg Simmel, but for an especially clear one, consider Marx's view that essential human good is transforming nature through productive labor. This activity necessarily has an external goal. You can't produce without producing something, and in conditions of scarcity, this goal will be something vital for humans' survival or comfort. But Marx held that when scarcity is overcome, and humans enter the realm of freedom, they'll still have work as their prime want, so they'll engage in the process of production for its own sake without any interest in its goal as such. Or consider Nietzsche's account of human greatness. In an early work, he said the one thing needful is to give style to one's character, so its elements are unified by a single taste, and that it doesn't matter so much whether this taste is good or bad so long as it's a single taste. Later, he used the same idea to explain the will to power, which he said involves not the multitude and disgregation of one's impulses, but their coordination under a single predominant impulse. In both passages, he deemed activities good if they involve organizing your desires around a single goal, whatever that goal is. So for both Marx and Nietzsche, a central human good was activity that on the one side is necessarily directed at a goal, but on the other derives its value from aspects of the process of achieving it. That's why the type of value they affirmed is paradigmatically illustrated by playing in games. When one's goal is trivial, the only possible value can be that of process. Marx and Nietzsche would never put it this way. Their styles are far too earnest. But what each valued was in effect playing in games. In Marx's case, the game of material production, when there's no longer any instrumental need for it. In Nietzsche's, the game of exercising power just for the sake of doing so. Playing in games also clearly straddles Aristotle's divide between kinesis and energeiae, showing he was wrong to recognize only those two types of activity. It has the logical structure of a kinesis, since it aims at a goal external to itself, and it passes the relevant grammatical test. If you've played golf or climbed a mountain, you're no longer doing so. But it also has value in itself, as an energeiae does, based on properties internal to it as an activity. Aristotle used his divide to deny that there can be significant intrinsic value in the process of producing a product. Game playing counters that argument. If playing in games is the paradigm expression of modern values, it also helps us see similar values in other activities not normally associated with games. Consider business activity. It sometimes aims at an independently good goal, such as relieving others' suffering or increasing their happiness, but often its goal is just to win market share and profits for one company, which is in itself trivial. There's no intrinsic value in people's drinking Coke rather than Pepsi, or using Microsoft systems rather than Apple. A classical view would therefore say economic activity has little intrinsic value, and philosophers like Aristotle did say that. But if winning market share is difficult, as it is, requiring a complex series of finely balanced decisions, then the modern view says it can have considerable worth, namely, that of process rather than product. And business activity can also involve something like the illusory attitude. While business people aim largely at profits for their shareholders and ultimately for themselves, many also value the exercise of business skill for its own sake, or just as skill, and are admired for it by others. These days, the business section of the newspaper often reads like the sports pages. Or consider artistic creation. It, too, has an independently good product if it aims, say, at communicating truths that can't be communicated in any other way. But a distinctively modern view, which isn't to say the only view held nowadays, says that art aims only at beauty, where that consists in organic unity or having the different elements of a painting, novel, or piece of music form a coherent, dynamic whole. On this view, it may be important that an artwork presents certain ideas, but it doesn't matter whether the ideas are true, only how well the work's other features are integrated with them. This modern view makes the value of artistic production rest on its creating, presumably intentionally, all the complex relations that define its product's beauty. So its value is like that of business activity and, more generically, of playing games. And creating art can also involve a illusory attitude, if an artist enjoys and values the skill his work involves for its own sake. More generally, the values found paradigmatically in playing in games can be found in any activity that is difficult and valued partly for its difficulty. In raising a family, running a community organization, renovating a house, and so on. So these values can be found in many activities, and therefore achieved by many people. Classical views tend to confine intrinsically valuable activity to the small elite who can discuss philosophy, contemplate God, or engage in whatever their stipulated highest activity is. By contrast, the modern view that suits defends extends the opportunity for a good life, democratically, to many people. So the Grasshopper is deceptively serious, defending a number of important philosophical theses, and this brings us back to the book's style. In contemporary philosophy, and certainly in the subfield of ethics, there's a tendency to high intellectual earnestness, as writers pursue grand philosophical projects in an appropriately grandiose tone. But this earnestness is often combined with a failure to address or even acknowledge the main objections to one's approach. Suits's Grasshopper has exactly the opposite combination of qualities. It's written in an engagingly light style, with many laugh-out-loud moments, but it's also completely philosophically serious, both in the importance of the claims it advances and in the integrity with which it defends them. It's not that philosophers should try to copy the Grasshopper's specific features. Given the book's uniqueness, that would be impossible. But the Grasshopper does offer a more abstract model for philosophical writers, serious about its ideas, but not self-serious about its own discussion of them. Would that there were more books like it.